When we started dividing up my parents' old house, I learned that my brother had secretly sold part of the property to friends. A protracted trial began. The family split up, and at the most unexpected moment, it was revealed that the house itself had been mortgaged to a bank during my father's lifetime. I never thought that family property could turn into a battlefield. But when my parents died, it all became so real that I still wake up in the middle of the night with this feeling of anxiety. My parents left us an old house that had stood in our neighborhood for more than 50 years, and I always thought of it as a place where we would gather as a family on holidays, where my childhood memories were almost tangible. When we started talking about dividing the property, I tried to remain as calm as possible because I knew that my brother was not the most reliable person. He was always impulsive, prone to quick decisions, and not always honest. But I did not expect everything to get out of control so quickly. The first division session went relatively peacefully. We sat around the table. My parents left a list of all the things that were considered valuable, and we tried to distribute them fairly. Everything was in the spirit of "I'll take this, you take that," and I really thought that we could do it without much conflict. But then I noticed something strange. There were some old paintings and some antiques in the attic that my parents had said should be in the house until we all figured out what to do with them. I decided to check them, just to be on the safe side, and I discovered that some of them were missing. At first I thought that someone had accidentally taken them for inspection, but when I went to my brother and asked where the paintings were, he just shrugged, said that they were probably in the basement, and tried to change the subject. It was immediately clear to me that something was wrong. I went back to the attic and started checking every corner, and that's when I came across some strange documents that looked like receipts and sales contracts. My heart sank when I realized that my brother had secretly sold some of the house's contents to his friends. Some of the things that should have stayed in the family had gone to who knows who for a ridiculous amount of money. I felt a pang inside, a mixture of anger, betrayal, and shock. I knew that if I told the family about this, there would be a huge scandal, but I could not just remain silent. That evening, when we gathered again to discuss the details of the division, I carefully placed the papers I had found on the table and said that there was something serious to discuss. The reaction was immediate. My mother immediately started screaming. My brother tried to justify himself, but the more he spoke, the more obvious it became that he had violated the trust. The whole family, including my mother-in-law and cousins, began to scream at the same time, each saying their own thing, blaming each other and me for raising this topic. I tried to explain that it was not me who did anything, that I had simply found the facts, but no one listened to me. My mother screamed that I had destroyed the family unit. My brother screamed that I had betrayed him, and at some point I realized that the situation had gotten so out of control that no one could hear anything except their own anger. I left the room, trying to collect myself, and at that moment, it became clear to me that this house and our relationship with it would take much longer to sort out than I expected. I sat on the porch, listening to the argument outside the window, and for the first time it occurred to me that the old house that had always seemed like a symbol of family was now a source of pain and mistrust. I knew that this would not be resolved quickly, and that at some point I would have to bring in lawyers to somehow protect the remaining property. All I wanted was to preserve the memory of my parents and a little justice for myself. But it seemed that even that was too much for our family. And when I went back inside to try to at least explain my vision, I realized that the word family no longer had the meaning it once had. The next day, I realized that I could not stand it any longer and decided to bring in a lawyer. I know this seems like a last resort, but the situation was out of control, and the emotions in the house made any discussion impossible. I contacted a lawyer who specialized in family law and inheritance, explained the situation as honestly as possible, provided documents I had found and receipts for the sale of property by my brother. The lawyer said that we had legal grounds to review these transactions, and if necessary, to annul them, because my brother had acted without the consent of the other heirs. I felt a little relieved for the first time. Someone other than me saw the whole situation from the outside and said that I was not crazy and not a traitor to the family. But when I told my brother and mother that I was calling a lawyer, they took it as a personal attack. My brother became nervous and aggressive, accusing me of turning the family property into a legal dispute, and my mother began to scream, repeating that I had destroyed trust and that none of us could now live peacefully under the same roof. I tried to explain that I wasn't looking for a war, that I just needed justice and protection for what belonged to the whole family. But all I heard in response was accusations. The lawyer came a few days later. He immediately offered to hold a meeting with everyone, where he would calmly present the facts and offer solutions. I saw how everyone in the room was tense, but it was important that at least one person spoke without emotion. The lawyer began by explaining the legal side. The property sale documents were signed only by the brother, without the consent of the heirs, which meant that the transactions could be challenged. He spoke calmly to the point, but each of his arguments became another point of contention. Mom cried, my brother screamed, accusing me of involving a lawyer and thereby betraying the family. Trying to keep the situation under control, the lawyer suggested breaking the process into several steps first, making a list of everything sold and assessing its value, then discussing which things could be returned and what would have to be compensated with money. This should have reduced the tension, but it didn't work. My brother started to explain that he thought his actions were normal, that his friends were willing to buy things at market price, and that I, in his opinion, had ruined the agreement, and now he felt betrayed. His arguments boiled down to the fact that it was he who had the right to make decisions, not me, and this caused an explosion of emotions from my mother, who screamed that he had no right to dispose of the inheritance without the consent of the family. Every time the lawyer tried to intervene and explain that we were talking about legal things, my brother and mother started shouting, and the rest of the relatives, who had gathered just to watch, began to intervene, taking sides. The room turned into chaos, and I realized that even a professional would not be able to keep everyone calm until each of us took a step back and tried to listen to each other. At some point, I just sat and watched adults acting like they were 30 years old, not 50 or 60, each screaming, trying to prove their case. The lawyer wrote everything down in a notebook, quietly explaining that it was normal. Emotions were inevitable, but we needed to record the facts. I tried to restrain myself, not to shout, not to interfere emotionally, which was difficult because the feeling of injustice was seething inside. I understood that if we did not start acting through official channels, we would simply remain in this chaos for many months, and the memory of my parents would be associated only with conflicts. In the evening, when the lawyer left, my brother went to his room. My mother sat in the living room and cried, and I was left alone on the porch, again watching the house, which now seemed alien. I thought about how everything used to be so simple: family, holidays, childhood memories. And now every corner of the house reminded me of betrayal and lies. I knew that the conflict would not end there, that I would have to raise even more questions, perhaps even go to court. But at the same time, I realized that if I did not take this step, nothing would change and my brother would continue to dispose of the property as he saw fit, and the whole family would continue to blame me for destroying what had not yet been destroyed. I felt strange, a mixture of responsibility, guilt, and inner relief that I had finally taken at least the first step towards the truth. I went to bed, but the sleep was restless. Every sound in the house made me remember how we yelled at each other, and I understood that the next step would be decisive for the entire inheritance and for whether we could somehow restore trust in each other. A couple of weeks after the lawyer began the audit, the situation moved to a completely new level. My brother called his friends, to whom he had sold some of the things, and began to collect his evidence, claiming that the transactions were completely legal, that he had the right to sell the property, and that I was allegedly interfering with his personal initiative. I understood that it was all a game, and that no one really cared about legality or morality. Everyone was just trying to win, but it was painful to hear it from my brother. The lawyer warned me that we could have serious difficulties, because if the transactions were formally drawn up and signed with the participation of third parties, it would be more difficult to challenge them, and part of the property could really go forever. I tried to explain to myself that this was not the end, that it was still possible to fight, but every day seemed to be a separate war, where every word and every step mattered. My brother began sending me messages where he threatened to go to court against me, claiming that I was violating his rights, that I was interfering with his legal transactions, that I was trying to take away his rightful property. I sat there, staring at the screen, and couldn't believe that my brother could so directly accuse me of trying to protect the common interests of the family. My mother was at a loss. She cried constantly and said that I was destroying the family, but even her words didn't sound as strong as before. I started writing down all the conversations and correspondence, as the lawyer advised, to have evidence, and with each new note I felt more and more exhausted and lonely. One day we gathered again at the house to discuss further steps. My brother came with printed receipts and contracts, showing that everything was done correctly, that all the transactions went through his friends who knew nothing about the inheritance. He spoke so confidently that for a moment I felt as if I was really losing some control. The lawyer tried to explain that formally the transactions may be legal, but morally this does not mean that they are fair, that there are grounds for challenging them if the heirs prove that the brother acted without their consent. But the brother interrupted and claimed that these were all just the words of a lawyer, and that he himself had done everything correctly. At that moment, for the first time, I felt a real threat. If we didn't act quickly, some of the things would be gone forever, and my brother would be convinced that he had done everything honestly. I realized that emotions would no longer help. I needed to act strategically. We began to make a list of the things that had been sold, comparing them with what my parents had left in their will. Each document I brought seemed like a reason for another argument to my brother. He constantly said that this is nonsense and that I was trying to slander him. The lawyer tried to keep the situation under control, but even he began to admit that on an emotional level we were moving through a minefield. One wrong step and the conflict would flare up again. I felt between two worlds. On the one hand, I understood that if I didn't protect the inheritance, I would lose not only the things, but also some of the memories of my parents. And on the other hand, every day of struggle ate away at my soul, and I began to doubt whether it was worth it. At one point, my brother began to openly threaten that if I continued to interfere, he would sue me and demand compensation for damage to his business reputation in front of the friends to whom he had sold the property. I sat and listened, and it seemed to me that all this was turning into some kind of absurdity. But the legal realities did not allow me to ignore the threat. The lawyer suggested that we prepare an official letter warning that any further sales without the consent of all heirs would be contested in court, and this could be our chance to bring everything under legal control. When we sent the letter, my brother exploded. He said that I had ruined his life, that I had killed trust, and that he now saw me as an enemy. Mom cried again and tried to reconcile us, but I saw that this was no longer a home where you could just sit and talk, where you could remember your childhood and laugh. It turned into a fight for law and justice, and every day I felt like I was alone against an army of emotions and lies. I knew it was a long road ahead, and that I would have to be extremely careful at this stage to not lose what was left of the inheritance, and to somehow preserve the remnants of my relationship with my family. I went to bed knowing that the next day would bring new threats and new evidence from my brother, and that this story was far from over, and the house that had once been a symbol of the family had turned into an arena for a legal battle. When the case went to court, I felt for the first time that everything had gotten out of control, and that now the decisions would not be made by the family, but by the lawyers and the judge. I never thought I would be in this place, sitting in a courtroom and looking at my brother, who a few months ago had seemed like an annoying relative, and now he was a full-fledged opponent in a legal battle. The trial began with my brother's lawyers trying to prove that all the transactions were legal, showing receipts, signatures, and agreements with his friends. I tried to remain calm, but inside I was seething with a sense of betrayal and disappointment. Every time the judge asked his brother a question, he confidently began to tell that he acted of his own free will, that none of the heirs were involved. But at the same time, as it turned out, some of his friends began to testify against him. One of the friends admitted that in fact they bought things not so much for themselves, but at the request of the brother, and that he told them that no one in the family would object, and they did not think that it would cause such a conflict. This fact turned the case upside down. Now the court began to consider that the brother had misled the buyers, and the transactions could have been made in violation of the interests of the heirs. I sat and tried to understand the full depth of what was happening. The situation that began with a simple family quarrel turned into a legal battle, where every step was carefully recorded and where every document could be decisive. The lawyer explained to me that the testimony of my brother's friends opened up the possibility of challenging the transactions and returning part of the property to the family. But the upcoming hearings would be long and exhausting. I felt a mixture of relief and fear. On the one hand, now we had a chance. On the other, I saw how trust was destroyed, how my brother fiercely resisted, and I understood that this was only the beginning of a long and painful journey. In the courtroom, I met my brother's eyes. His expression was a mixture of anger and confusion. He understood that the game was moving to a completely new stage. The lawyer asked questions. My brother was asked about documents and amounts, and his friends revealed details that no one in the family knew before. For example, it turned out that my brother promised to return part of the money to the buyers after we allegedly accepted his terms, which no one discussed, and it looked like an attempt at manipulation. The judge wrote down all the facts, sometimes asked clarifying questions, and I saw how the picture gradually became clear. My brother had no right to dispose of the property alone, and his transactions could be declared invalid. Each time we discussed these issues with the lawyer outside the court, I felt how emotions and logic were mixed. On the one hand, this was a legal battle. On the other, a moral and emotional drama of the family. I began to realize that even if we won the case, the trust in my brother would be destroyed forever, and the memory of my parents would be associated not with warm memories, but with this endless conflict. In between sessions, I watched my brother's friends, who were constantly talking to each other, discussing how it all happened, who knew what, and this revealed new details that the lawyer immediately wrote down. Each new fact gave us an additional argument, but at the same time made me think that the family history would never be the same again. In the evenings, I sat alone at home, rereading documents, correspondence, and testimony, and realized that the house, which had once been a symbol of the family, had now become a place of legal control, a place where emotions and cold facts constantly collide. I tried to find a balance between the desire to protect the inheritance and the desire to preserve the remains of the relationship with my brother. But with each passing day, it became more and more difficult. Sometimes I caught myself thinking that perhaps this whole conflict was not only about things, but about power, control, and recognition. My brother was trying to prove that he could make decisions on his own. I was trying to prove that justice should be shared. In that moment, I realized that perhaps this trial would teach me more than any childhood memory, that trust takes time to build and can be lost in an instant, and that legal documents can be more inflexible than family ties. I began to understand that no matter the outcome of the trial, our family's lives would be changed forever, and we would have to find a way to move on, even if no one was completely happy. The trial lasted for weeks, and each day brought new details. New testimony from my brother's friends, new documents that revealed hidden transactions, my brother's attempts to defend his every move. I watched his confidence crumble, his feet begin to fall, and it both pleased and alarmed me. Pleased because justice was beginning to prevail, alarmed because the knowledge that even a victory would not restore our relationship made everything even more painful. One day, when the lawyer showed the judge again the facts about how my brother had been misled by buyers, I felt for the first time that we could actually return some of the property to the family. But I also realized that the process would drag on for months. And during that time, every conversation with my brother would be a test of patience. Every mention of the house would be a blow to my emotions, and that I would forever associate the family home with a legal battle, with secrets being revealed, and with the need to act not as a son, but as a man who protects what is dear to him. The trial continued, and with each passing week the situation became more tense. My brother began to actively involve the lawyers of his friends who had bought the property, and now we had a whole supporting army in the courtroom, each of whom was trying to prove that the transactions were legal and that no one had the right to challenge them. I sat and tried to control myself, but the tension was unbearable. Each new paper, each new argument from my brother and his friends added fuel to the fire, and the lawyer, although he remained calm, had difficulty recording all the new details. The judge demanded precise evidence of each transaction, and suddenly documents surfaced that showed that some items were sold for much less than their market value, and it looked as if my brother was trying to deceive not only the family, but the buyers themselves. I saw his face change. From a confident man, he gradually turned into someone desperately trying to stay afloat. My brother's lawyers began to put forward new counterarguments, claiming that I was violating the rights of his friends, interfering in the transactions, and trying to manipulate the process. I tried to explain to the judge that I was simply protecting the legitimate interests of the heirs, but it seemed like each new document escalated the conflict, making the process endless and exhausting. At one point, the lawyer said we would have to hire experts to appraise every item, and I realized that would add months to the process, more stress, and more reasons to argue. Outside of court, the tension at home became almost unbearable. My brother would not speak to me without sarcasm. My mother would cry trying to convince us to stop fighting, and the rest of the relatives had already begun to divide into camps, each defending their own side and blaming the other. I felt like we were literally losing our family. Not the property, but the ability to be together without constant hostility. New documents the lawyer found showed that my brother had been selling property to friends before we had even officially begun the division process, in what looked like a deliberate attempt to bypass all the heirs. The judge asked us to provide written statements about who knew what and when, and I could see my brother starting to panic, because now everything he said could be used as evidence against him. New facts came out from my brother's friends. One admitted that after buying things, my brother told him that this is for the house until the heirs intervene, which clearly points to an attempt at manipulation and concealment of information. I felt a mixture of relief and fear. On the one hand, justice is on our side. On the other, the process is dragging on, and each new week is another emotional blow to the whole family. The lawyer warned that if we did not act carefully, my brother could start filing counterclaims, accusing me of slander, pressure, and attempts to disrupt market transactions, and this would only complicate the process. I tried to control myself, but at night I woke up in a cold sweat, thinking about how the house, which used to be a symbol of childhood and family, had now turned into an arena of battle, where victory at any cost is more important than human relationships. At one point, the judge suggested mediation to try to find a compromise, but my brother categorically refused, arguing that compromise is capitulation, and I saw how this decision made any attempts at reconciliation almost impossible. Every new listener in the courtroom, every paper, every little thing began to seem decisive, and I began to notice that I was almost at the limit emotionally. Day after day, the tension was growing, and sleep and peace were becoming an unattainable luxury. The lawyer tried to prepare a strategy to challenge the most controversial transactions, but the more we moved, the more facts emerged that could complicate the process. Some of my brother's friends began to complain that they also felt like victims, and now they were demanding compensation. And this added another layer of complexity. Now not only my brother, but also his entourage was trying to protect themselves, and the judge looked at all this with obvious bewilderment. I sat, held all the documents, listened to the lawyers, and understood that at this stage, even a legal victory would not be easy. The process turned into a marathon, where every step requires extreme concentration. Every word can be used against us, and each new document reveals even more complications. I saw that my strength was at its limit, that my brother was completely on the defensive, and I was still trying to maintain control without losing not only the property, but also the last crumbs of trust and memory of my parents. And as I walked home, passing by the rooms where we used to laugh and celebrate, I felt that the family was gradually dissolving in endless court battles, and that we would have to make decisions not only legally, but also morally, in order to survive this chaos and try to save at least something from what was once called home. When the judge announced that the hearings were approaching their final stage, I felt my heart pounding in my chest harder than ever. All this time, we lived in a war mode, where every word, every paper, and every little thing mattered. And now everything came down to what decision the court would make. The atmosphere in the courtroom was heavy. The air literally vibrated with tension, and every look in my brother's eyes was full of hatred and fear at the same time. His lawyers tried to the last to prove that the deals were honest, that he acted in the interests of the family, that all the receipts and signatures speak for themselves. But it was at this moment that something happened that no one expected. One of his closest friends, who initially supported him, suddenly changed his testimony. He admitted that his brother had asked him to store the items temporarily, and that the real terms of the deal were quite different. There had been no real sale, but a way to hide the property before the other heirs found out. The courtroom went silent, and I saw my brother's face turn pale. This admission turned the case upside down, because now it was not just about an illegal sale, but about a deliberate deception of the family and an attempt to hide the property. The judge listened attentively, taking notes, and for the first time in my life, I felt that the truth was finally beginning to speak louder than the shouting and accusations. But with this admission came new problems. The lawyers for my brother's friends began to defend their clients, claiming that they did not know of his true intentions and that they, too, had been deceived. This meant that new lines of conflict were now appearing in the case, and my brother found himself not only against me, but also against his own allies. I watched this with a strange feeling, a mixture of relief that the truth was coming out, and anxiety that the process might be delayed even further because of these new circumstances. My mother sat behind me, her face tired and empty, as if all her strength had been drained. She looked at my brother and me as if we were two strangers, and for the first time I understood that, no matter what the court decided, our family would never be the same again. At the next hearing, my brother tried to turn the tide. He said that he had acted out of desperation, that he wanted to save the property from ruin, and that I had exaggerated everything. His lawyers insisted that there was no direct evidence of intent other than what his friends had said, and that the whole situation was the result of my personal revenge. The judge listened attentively, but it was already clear that the arguments were losing weight, especially after our lawyer provided copies of messages in which my brother himself wrote that we need to hide things while no one knows. When these lines were read aloud, I felt a wave of emotion wash over the room. Some sighed, others began to whisper, and my brother covered his face with his hands. That was the moment I knew his game was up, but there was no joy in it. Instead, there was a heavy feeling of emptiness. I had won, but at the same time I had lost everything that was important to the family. The judge said the final decision would be made in a week, but it was already clear that most of the transactions would be invalidated. We would be able to get the property back, but the price for that was too high. The evening after the hearing, I sat alone in my room, looking at pictures of my parents and trying to figure out what they would say if they saw what their family had become. I felt neither joy nor pride, only fatigue and the knowledge that we had destroyed ourselves for the sake of the property that was once supposed to unite us. I knew that there would be long conversations ahead, new wounds and new attempts to restore what was almost impossible to restore. And yet, deep down, I knew that if I had not gone all the way, my brother would have continued to lie and use us, and then I would have lost not only the property, but also my self-respect. Now all I had to do was wait for the court's decision, and figure out how to move on when the word family no longer meant what it had meant my entire life. The day the court's decision was announced had arrived, and I could feel my body shaking with tension, although I tried to hide it. We were sitting in the courtroom, my brother with his lawyers, his friends, my mother, who looked as if the last few months had aged her by a decade, and me next to my lawyer, who was quietly repeating that we had every chance. The judge came in, opened a folder with documents and began to read the decision. He had declared the transactions invalid, the property was to return to the estate, and all further actions were to take place only with the consent of all heirs. This was the moment I had been waiting for all this time, and logically I should have felt relief. But instead, there was emptiness inside me. I looked at my brother. His face was gray. He was sitting with his head down, and his lawyers were nervously writing something down. I knew that this was a defeat for him, but the unexpected happened just a few minutes later. The judge added that the review of the documents had uncovered other facts that none of us had suspected. It turned out that years before his death, my father had executed a trust deed with the bank, pledging some of the property, including our old house, as collateral for a loan. None of us knew about it because my father had kept it a secret, and the papers had only come to light through due diligence initiated by the lawsuit. The judge explained that the bank now had a legal claim on the house, and that if the debt was not paid soon, the property could be sold to cover it. There was a silence in the courtroom, and I felt the ground shift from under my feet. All of our arguing, shouting, recriminations, months of legal battles suddenly became worthless in an instant because it turned out that the house itself had never been ours in the first place. My mother began to cry, and my brother looked up, and for the first time in a long time he looked like he, too, was lost, not just angry. His friends looked at each other, not understanding what would happen next, and I sat and thought that if we had known this earlier, we might have behaved completely differently. The lawyer quietly told me that we had options. We could join forces and pay off the debt to save the house, or refuse, allowing the bank to take the property. This was the very turn that no one could have imagined. We fought with each other, accused, humiliated, tore the family to pieces, and it turned out that the real enemy all this time was not among us, but in the papers that my father hid during his life. At that moment, I looked at my brother, and for the first time in months felt not anger, but a strange feeling that we both lost. All our victories and defeats in court were only temporary illusions, because the final reality turned out to be much harsher. When we left the courtroom, my mother could not walk alone. We supported her from both sides. My brother was silent, and his silence was heavier than any words. I didn't know what we would do next, whether we would try to unite to save the house or go our separate ways. But I knew one thing for sure. The house that had been the symbol of our family had become our common grave, not a physical one, but an emotional one, because it was around it that we had destroyed everything that had bound us together. And now the question was not who had won the trial, but whether we would ever be able to call each other family again.